Okay, welcome to the new episode of All That Jazz. I'm your host Matyash, and I have with me Erin Finkelstein with me. I hope I pronounced that right.
And
Welcome to the podcast.
thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for being on. And she is a something that I'm really fascinated by, which is Feldenkrais method. When I first heard of it, I thought this is a really interesting method, and even beside the name being interesting, it's also I tried it once, and it was in London, and I was working in as a cleaner, and I was having trouble lifting up things, and like I thought maybe I could use some help, and I heard of this, and I went there, and I remember having very ruggedy shoes, and she actually gave me a discount of like, I don't know, it was like 50 pounds, and she British pounds, so about probably about $60 straight. So she gave me like almost like $30 off because she felt bad for me because of my rugged shoes that I used for work and all that. So she thought I was really poor, which I kind of was. Anyway, I appreciated that, but I have to say after that session that I felt like I could I could move really easily. So is that part of what happens basically when people go to Feldenkrais?
Absolutely. So the method is taught really in two ways. Awareness through movement classes are group classes that are verbally taught. And it sounds like you probably had a one-on-one session, which
Yes.
is called a functional integration lesson. So Moshé really left a huge body of work of awareness through movement lessons that are cataloged. They were all reel to reel. And one of our dear colleagues translated them all into volumes for the practitioners to use. But the functional integration is taking these concepts in the awareness through movement lessons and translating them through touch. And we consider it to be having a conversation with the nervous system. So
Hmm.
we're really interested in learning how to use our design to the best of its ability. And that's not something that we're taught in schools or anywhere really. Even if we go to a yoga class or if we go to a judo class, there's those methods are amazing and wonderful. But what the Feldenkrais method does, it helps you to achieve anything you want to be doing in those classes, or say moving, just moving easier. I
Mm-hmm.
remember was a young person in my 20s, and people told me to take yoga to help me relax, and I did, and I enjoyed it. And but I really, even in that modality, I felt like I was missing something. I could not touch my toes. I was 18, and I thought, if I can't touch my toes now, we're going to have really some problems later on. So there was a lot that I didn't know about myself and my body and how to use it. I was very sort of cerebral and intellectually based. And this method really helped me just to completely learn how to be in myself for any age. So,
Would you say it helped you more than yoga?
yes, I feel that I really like and respect yoga and yogis.
Did you do hatha yoga? You
Don't
don't.
know. I did so many different kinds of yoga.
Okay.
It's kind of another part of my life. So, um, but this method is really about learning. So its aim is a little bit maybe different. And I found it to be so powerful after one or two lessons. And the variety within the lessons was also very attractive to me. So we have awareness through movement lessons that are on breathing, and not say breathing one way, but breathing 40 different ways.
Wow.
Um, and so the idea of Feldenkrais's idea was really about freedom and really about how to get the organism to have as many choices in life. So the movement lessons are really about creating choice in the nervous system, choices in your patterns of habits and habits of movement.
Right. Is it
So
like you're not using something correctly? And because I remember one comment I read online is that after the classes, you would go around and you see some people walking around the city. The way they walk, you could just tell they're not using their body correctly because they're just using their I don't know, their legs. They're walking just with their legs, or I don't know. There's different types of walking, right?
right. So what you said is really, really important. And the question was, do we teach people how to walk correctly? And I'm going to tell you that answer is no, because people walk the way that they learned how to walk and they do the best that they know how to do. And there's nothing to say that there's anything necessarily wrong with that. That is your habitual way of walking. So we all have habits, neurological movement habits. I'm not talking necessarily like, the habit of sitting in front of the TV, at dinner or something, even though that is technically a movement. I mean, when you wake up in the morning and you get out of bed and you brush your teeth, you have performed already dozens of movement habits that you're not necessarily aware of. You brush your teeth with one hand, not the other hand. Half the
Right.
population brushes it with the other hand. So now you can apply that concept to something like walking, and you see how complicated it can be. And so the idea is not so much to fix people, but to teach people how many more options they have than the ones that happen automatically. Because a habit is fast. You don't think about it. You probably don't think about which hand you're going to brush your teeth with, right? But I
Right.
suggest week that you try brushing your teeth with the other hand, and just sense all the things you learn about that. And
So
yeah,
so
that's essentially
teaching people how to do it differently, is that the people are probably wondering what's behind you. That kind of reminds me of classroom. You've had it in primary school sometimes, in biology class, I think,
right.
would be this.
And so so we have this amazing design within us for support and for movement. And the skeletal system is controlled by the muscles, right? But what really controls the muscles is your mind. So people talk about muscle memory as though you do something over and over and over, and suddenly your muscle has a little brain and it remembers it. Well, that's not true. Your brain is actually in control of your muscles. Over time, we get habits, whether they're positive or negative, and whether they're from how we use ourselves or from our society, right? So Moshé came from as a child, he lived in Russia during kind of a very tense wartime, and he ended up walking at the age of 13 to Palestine.
Wow.
And so this method is really encapsulates not just movement, but sort of human development, psychology, and how to become our own masters, so to speak, or become the most potent version of ourselves that we can. And one of the ways he taught that was to help people sense how the skeleton's designed to move. So if you have a habit of moving one way, right, whatever that habit is, however you move, right, but you didn't know that, say, the arm could go this way or that way for whatever reason, that by exploring, you not only free up options in your own movement, but it frees up options in your thinking, and it affects your psychology as well. So he came about in a time when Freud was very big, this idea that you go to a psychologist and you recount your childhood traumas, and somehow by getting that off your chest, it goes away, or you're able to live your life fuller. And there is a lot of benefit to that. But Feldenkrais thought, the more you repeat something in a movement pattern, the more ingrained it gets. So he had this concept that actually you can change the patterns in your brain by changing the physical patterns in your nervous system, in
Hmm.
your movement patterns. And that was one of the greatest things I got out of awareness through movement lessons, that maybe I didn't experience so much in yoga, although maybe had I kept going with it, I would have. But I would go into a movement class feeling one way after studies and very tense or whatever, and I would leave like a completely different person mentally, physically,
Wow.
but also mentally. Um, and so after my training program, the training programs are set up to be spread out over 4 years, and I think that is done in part because what we're looking at doing is really changing people's brains.
So that
And I,
takes a while, right, to
it's a,
change.
yeah, so I can honestly say that my personality and how I deal with life really changed between my early 20s and my late 20s.
I wish we had the before and after, like a commercial. I used to be like this, but now I'm like this.
Very serious before. Very,
You know why? That's why I think this online business guy that's very popular, Gary Vaynerchuk, and his belief system is that people want to see the process, and I very much agree with that. If you, let's say, I'm sure of this, if you had recorded, like done a daily vlog, and then after the 4 year process did 20 or 30 minute video, then you could see your progression and how you changed. I think that's like 500,000 views right there.
it's true. And I think that people are constantly changing all the time, whether they
Yeah.
know it or not. But this method for me just really gave me a lot of tools, that I needed in my early 20s that I just didn't have. Um, but that being said, the work is really for everyone. I really enjoy working with the aging population, and helping people learn how to use their skeleton at every stage of the game. So I have quite a few um, clients with scoliosis, and helping them feel different in their body is just really very rewarding. I also work with kids with cerebral palsy,
Hmm.
um, who have very rigid movement patterns, and just to give them a sense that there is another way to feel in your body.
Hmm.
And then
So
musicians, and I mean, it just kind of has a very wide array of clientele.
right, musicians in particular, because they use repetitive movements, and if they're using their body wrong, or dancers, let's say, dancers probably because they use repetitive movements, and if they have a style that uses the same things over and over, and if they use it the wrong way, then uh, then it could result in an injury over time, right?
It can, but I'm also going to just challenge you a little bit, because a part of what this is the thinking behind the work, right? So it's also just kind of like a mental state, to think about life and movement in a certain way. So it's not necessarily that a dancer or musician uses himself wrong, although that does happen and this can help. But it's also what happens when a musician or a dancer or an athlete gets so good at their particular swing or their particular dance movement, but it's so habitual that it no longer feels fresh. Then what do, right? So part of what this work does is it helps people at really high levels as well to regain joy and regain ease, and regain like a freshness to their experience with their art form or their sport. And we do that in very specific ways to challenge the pattern that is so habitual. Again, it comes back to that idea of like brushing your teeth. It's just the simplest thing, if that were a sport, right? And you're just so good at it, but you don't think about it anymore necessarily. And how do you keep growing within that super habitual organization.
Hmm.
So playing with changing left and right, playing with somatically slowing it down to feel, you know, what new options are available in this movement that's so habitual that could free up some space in the brain for it to feel good again or feel fresh and new and enjoyable again.
Yeah, I had that feeling when I went to the session, and there was some like I didn't expect this, but there was just some. She was manipulating me in some slowly in some just weird ways, and then she asked me to stand up, and I remember her saying, "Well, you're using your legs all wrong when you stand up," and then we did how I walk forward and how I walk back, and then she's like, "Notice the difference how you walk back more naturally than you when you walk forward." And
Uh-huh.
she's like, "Practice walking back," and I was like, that's interesting. So when I was going back home, I was trying, walking back a little bit, and it was interesting. Like there's a noticeable difference how I was walking back versus how I was walking forward.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
so when you went back to walking forward, could you sense that change, that inquiry of walking backwards or changing the pattern, right? The habitual pattern can then have influenced the habitual pattern in the other direction.
Yes. Yeah, I did like for about a period of a month or so. I sometimes remembered it, and then I would because then you kind of notice how it feels when you walk the right way versus when not the but in a more
Cool.
fluid way versus just using your legs. So that's why earlier when I said people really notice how people walk is because I think they've had an experience of change, and then they start because they aware they start to notice that other people are walking in a way they're totally unconscious of, you know.
Right, absolutely. And walking is quite complicated, right? And we learn it and we just do it and we don't think about it until we have a problem or we can't do something that we want to be able to do. I mean, like me touching my toes or running. I always wanted to learn how to run in my 20s and I'd try and it was just so miserable, but people really loved it.
Learning to run, love to run.
And, for exercise.
Okay.
Before I did this, I just couldn't figure out how people enjoyed running so much. And then, through a series of, these lessons where you start to sense like, where is the hip joint? How does it relate to the foot? And where is my spine? And what is that sense of lightness or heaviness? Or so it's these really beautifully guided, crafted lessons to help you just investigate what's already there
Right.
and then to have more than one option, two options, three options. Can you walk, with an eye patch on one eye? What do you learn from that? Then do it on the other eye.
So it seems like it's like adaptability with what you have because if I read a little bit about Moshé Feldenkrais, the founder, and he was uh, after his I think he was a knee injury during playing football or soccer, and after he developed the method, he was able to overcome that. But it seems like you find another way of using the knee, or if somebody has let's say a spinal problem, if you do the Feldenkrais exercise or if you go to a one-to-one session, then you could probably find another way to use your body that's working with what you have, right?
Yeah, absolutely. His thinking really was he had that knee. Moshe had that knee injury, and then he recovered, but then he re-injured it later working on submarines. And at that point, he went to a doctor and, knee surgery in the 40s or 50s. Maybe it was a little later, but, the prognosis, he was a scientist. So when they said it was like about a 50% chance he'd be able to walk again, he thought those weren't great odds. I can't imagine what a knee surgery looked like in the 50s, but he thought, so he applied his scientific background to himself and also watching children learn how to move. He incorporated what he observed in their nervous system, how slow they moved, how they really sense themselves. This is like before their brains are cognitive to know enough to know, like, I'm going to take a step. Before they have the language, what do they do in order to take a step? What are babies doing? So he combined all of that in physiology and all of that to figure out, well, if I take 100 steps perfectly and then the 101st step, my knee blows out, what did I do differently in that moment?
Right.
Cause that, right? And so that's kind of where the method started to develop a little bit, because he was such an active person. He was the first judo master in the West, really, and brought judo to France. And so he was just a very physical person. So this was a big problem for him to solve. Um, and he also worked with a lot of scientists who were in front of papers and books, and who were very uncomfortable all the time. So he started doing these awareness through movement experiences with them to try to help them, at first verbally and throughout his career verbally, because then he could teach hundreds of people at a time that way. One-on-one is, much more limited in terms of how many people you can reach. But
Right.
people were having this experience like, wow, that was such an easy change to feel that, oh, I sit all the way over on this side all the time. I didn't even know that I could go over here, or could go here, or could go here. And so those awareness through movement lessons really developed out of his own knee injury and out of working with others.
Yeah,
So
he was unique in that he was seemed to be highly intellectual and very accomplished. But also he was a judo master, and so um, he had the intellectual side and the physical activity side too, and both to a high degree. And this is very, very rare. I think I don't, because like when I think about like highly intellectual people, they're Einstein, all these, they were not physically active people. Like I can't think of another example where it would be highly proficient in judo or any kind of sport and be also intellectually productive.
it is a very interesting combination that isn't found very often. And I think in part, this is one thing that was so interesting to him about people. Why is it that it seems like they live in one area of their brain or the other? And what would happen if we all had the tools to become the most potent? He used that word a lot, the most potent, or the to the highest ability that each one of us has. What is stopping us from accessing all those different parts of our brain? So one of the books that he wrote, it was, I think, published posthumously, but The Potent Self is maybe my favorite book of his, because it just, you read one paragraph of it and your brain just soaks it in.
Wow, I need to read that.
I thought you might like The Potent Self, because it really, that book in particular, his writing's a little thick, but that book in particular has a lot of sort of the psychological components of the work included in it as well. So it's this idea of, right, everything that happens to us in our life can become habitual, whether we're aware of it or not. And so how do we release ourselves from those patterns in our brain, and then that go down into the patterns in our muscles, which affect how we move?
Yeah, it seems like everything we do, if we do it repeatedly, you're gonna tend to do, and even that's physically as well as other habits in life. And I find that to be very, very true, and it can be for the better or for the worse, and that's the scary part.
Right. And so when you start to really investigate, how do your habits work and what does it take to change them, really? Um, it's really a fascinating project. And we can actually do this little exercise. It's something I like to do. And for
Okay.
those listening at home, so just clasp your hands together, interlace your hands together, and let them apart a couple of times. And just notice that for most people, not all, but for most people, you do that one way without thinking about it, right? If you look down, there's one thumb on top. Yes. So
Mm-hmm.
is your right thumb or your left thumb on top?
Right.
Your right is. Mine happens to be also. In a group of 200 people, half the people would have their left thumb on top. So that's just a habit you didn't know you had. And so these awareness to movement lessons are exploring all these habits you didn't know you had. So now let's pretend that for whatever reason you needed to learn how to do it the other way. So now
Right.
just put it so the left thumb is on top. Now, sometimes musicians don't feel a huge difference because of how they use their hands. So if you're at home thinking this isn't feeling different, that's okay. Just brush
Right.
your teeth away for a week. So if you wanted to make that feel more normal, how do you learn how to do that? So go really slowly. Just
Right.
bring your hands together extremely slowly and start to imagine which finger is going to touch first and what that's like, right? And so
Mm.
that's just a very, very simple experience of how to have choice. But Feldenkrais thought, well, you need to be able to have true choice, which is to be able to do things 3 ways or 4 ways. So then just bring the first finger over the thumb and just feel how weird that is.
First finger. What do you mean? But
Right.
this, I've when I first did it the other way, it felt very, very weird.
Uh-huh. So
Uh,
now if you have a thumb on top, now just bring your digits over one more so that you have your thumb
oh, like here.
right.
Oh,
Okay. And
weird.
then back. So this is kind of a short little mini awareness movement lesson. And then just go back to your habitual way and notice if anything changed about that. Did your fingers get clearer? Maybe not in that amount of time, but it's an experience of when you do things 3 or 4 different ways, then when you go back to your habitual way feels fresh and new again. So that's a simple, experience, but these lessons were actually designed for like the whole gamut. So something as simple as that to learning how to do a headstand. And in fact, there's this great story of Moshé putting Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel. Ben-Gurion went to Feldenkrais and said, I've never been a very physical person, but I'd love for you to teach me how to stand on my head. And they actually broadcast this live on the beach in Israel, and people were so mad because it was the first prime minister, and they thought, oh, this kook Feldenkrais is going to hurt our first prime minister. But there's a wonderful picture of him on his head, clearly not a physical, older gentleman, and clearly hasn't had a big physical life necessarily. And here he was standing on his head. And there's actually a statue on the beach now of him on his head. So I just love
wow.
that because it's kind of this idea of like anybody can do the Feldenkrais method in order to learn how to be more physically satisfied with themselves at any point in their life. And that's what really kind of got me interested, even as a young person, to think, how do I keep changing? How do I keep, I can't see the future, but how do I make the best out of it?
Right. It it seems like it makes you more aside of the um it makes personality changes, makes you more flexible and let's say less rigid. Well, maybe you need to be rigid in some ways, but also in life you need to be flexible in other ways. And it seems like maybe it changes your character in a way as well.
I think probably it's very much not black and white. And I remember stories about Moshé, arguing, one side of an argument one evening and then coming in the next morning and arguing the other side, the Democratic at night and Republican in the morning.
Right.
And just to kind of prove to the students almost that don't follow me. It's not about following what I say. Think for yourself. And there's so much gray zone in between. So, and these lessons, a lot of times he does put in certain constraints,
Mm-hmm.
so the direction will be to slowly move your shoulder or whatever, but don't move something else.
Right.
And those constraints are there in order for you to feel whatever you're not feeling, whatever or things are designed to move that maybe your nervous system doesn't know. So you have to have quite an open mind in these lessons, and you have to be willing to not please the teacher, because and which is not what our society is set up to do educationally, right? I mean, education is about sort of conformity in a certain sense societally. And I remember going into these classes in my early 20s and I just couldn't figure out how to do it right. And then I realized that wasn't the point. And then it was like, that's not the point of life. It
Right.
changed my whole outlook. Um, my whole outlook.
Because there are multiple ways. So you just play around with it basically.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah.
Well, it's different than engineering, let's say. In engineering, you have to do it right. You have to, otherwise the bridge is gonna collapse and all that. But a lot of things in life aren't like that, and there's no clear black or white choices, and that's why this method is like there's no right or wrong, and as long as you're doing healthy, how to pick up 10 pounds. But
Right.
there's multiple right ways to pick up 10 pounds, and that's the point.
Right. And what's interesting is that he was an engineer. So, these lessons, in the breadth of them, sometimes they do deal with very structural kinds of things, but he gives you these constraints so that you feel that construction that he's trying to get you to sense. Yet it's not a cut and dry ABC, you do this in order to feel this. It's so much more organic. So I just think he did a brilliant job of combining all of these elements, and I just wish he lived longer to see how what we know now. He died in 1982, I think, or 83, somewhere in there. And so science at that point didn't even believe that neuroplasticity, which is the brain's ability to change and grow throughout time, they didn't believe that was true because they couldn't see it yet. Science is all about proving what you can see.
Right.
In like the 90s, right? Where the first neuroplasticity, they could actually see the dendrites connecting under the microscope and all of that. So the Feldenkrais peaked, right? A little bit too early in the scientific community, I think. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's not as well known.
Right.
Um, his timing he was so ahead of his time. And he was a scientist, but he challenged what was sort of the common knowledge at that point, because he experienced it. He
Right.
experienced the change in himself, and he experienced the change in all the people that would come and work with him.
Talk about you said muscle memory. That's something I notice in sports. They some players often, let's say basketball, because I watched a lot of basketball in my life, and some players talk about muscle memory. But you said it's in the mind, and so but that's like with anything. A lot of things that we do is muscle memory, like you said. And if you do it more often, like players to get better, what did they do? They practice more. But they practice on trying to do the right way. So they will change the shot form and make it nice. But then, like there's a story of a famous story of Steph Curry. He was, I think, in college, and he was not shooting well. And then one summer, for a painful 2 or 3 months, he changed the way he shot. And it was painful because every day he felt like a beginner and all that. But after those 2 or 3 months, his shot was amazing. But it was like a long process for him to get that shot right. And so, yeah, like, does it often take a long time for people to, or is it like, do most things happen in one session, or? or how does this work?
That's a great question. And it is so, individual. And I'll answer that question by sort of answering how sometimes people ask me, well, how do you do an ATM lesson every day? Um, and I don't. I sometimes I'll get into it and really do a whole lesson every day. I teach them, online once a week, so I obviously prepare for that lesson. But for me, and I'm a musician, so I do have this repetitive kind of same sort of thing where you have a skill that you're always trying to hone a little bit. But for me, after going through a training program and having a practice for 13 years of working with people, it's almost a change in mindset, and that is part of the practice, right? So I do get on the floor and I do lessons and I do inquiry all the time, but instead of it being like this thing I'm always practicing, it's more that it's a way of being. It's a way of becoming present in every moment so that you can have choice.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you know how that basketball, when you really know the right way, or the right way for you, that 2-month process that he went through, right? He started with his habitual, which was not good enough for him. He challenged his nervous system to learn the new muscle memory or the new habit. And then the more you repeat that new habit, it's not that he couldn't go back to this way. And in fact, he probably always has to go. It probably sneaks in as something that is always there, that he's that challenging, because our habits, our oldest habits, are always, they don't go away necessarily, right?
Right. I think it
They,
was his father that helped him as well. So he had a coach. His father was also an NBA player, but his father obviously had experience. So he was like, no, no, because he could see obviously a lot of, if you're observing somebody, oftentimes you will observe things that they can themselves don't see. And
that's
so
right.
he'd be like, do it the other way.
And so what's interesting is what his nervous system was able to do, was able to translate those words or those observations from an external source into kinesthetic learning, or learning, organic learning from the inside. And that's what's really challenging for a lot of people. And that's what we teach, is how do you translate? I mean, people told me how tense I was playing my clarinet for years. And it was like, well, I just don't, if I let go of everything, I'm just going to be a skeleton on the floor. So I don't really learn how to figure out, well, where am I holding that tension? How does it relate to my skeleton? Maybe it doesn't, maybe I don't have to do that. And then one thing that we do a lot is changing orientations to gravity. So playing with it, laying on the floor, in a chair, face down, because all of that gives your nervous system information.
Yeah, it's like almost like you're playing like compared to exercise where you're just like one way and trying to build muscle. This is like you're playing with the body and seeing how it moves, and seeing all the different options
Yeah,
rather than just go hardcore in one method.
that's exactly what it is. And it's really accessing the deeper part of your brainstem that's responsible for movement. And that
Mhm.
is not the same part of your brain that takes in words, right? The cognitive part of your brain that maybe says, your basketball, when it leaves your hand, those are words, right? But the older part of our brain, when, before we learned how to talk, we learned how to walk. Well, how do we do that? That's essentially what we're doing. And that part of our brain is always with us. We just don't know about it until we know about it. And then it just becomes much, you learn how to work with that part of your brain. You learn what that part of your brain needs to slow down. Um, and I want to say something else about the basketball player, because I think this is really important.
Hmm.
Um, this idea that, whatever you practice becomes the way you do it, right?
It's like
So
in
if you
nature almost, yeah.
becomes your habit, right? And so in that 2-month period of his change, another thing that we would add to that, which I know a lot of athletes do, is practicing in the mind. and without physically doing it. And sometimes in awareness through movement lessons, I will teach the lesson on one half the body, do it, do it, do it, and then imagine it on the second half of the body. And almost every time people comment that the imagination was clearer and easier. And so that's why I make the separation between this word muscle memory, because it's really just your memory, it's your mind. And the muscles happen to then fire in that way, right? But you can practice a change or practice this kind of difference. And musicians do this all the time too, right? We imagine the piece of music, especially if you're working on something from memory. Your ability to imagine is very important for changing habits and having choice. And I think it's a skill that's being lost really in society,
Imagination.
imagination, like the
Yeah, I
ability.
think it's a lot of smartphones, everything. We have YouTube and everything. Not that that's bad. It's just that I think sometimes we need time off and just to think, like and imagine things. I think the creativity stems from that. People used to like be around the house with no TV, no computers, nothing back uh, even like 20 years ago or more, like 30 years ago, and you had to play games like as kids. Even when I was growing up and in the 90s, like there wasn't much video games. There was okay a little bit, but like there was also play that uses creativity and imagining things and so forth.
Yeah, and I think that's a real problem in our society. I think that, with I think I agree with you. All of that we have now is so amazing. But I think these kinds of practices are just incredibly important for the health of a brain. And the smartphones and video games, I mean, they work faster than our brains do. And so our brains are kind of always exhausted if we don't take the time out to just lie on the floor and try something different and imagine and just go inside. And I think it's just
Right.
very important.
I like the you said difference because I read one book about Winston Churchill, and he was a big believer in doing something, but then he wouldn't rest. He would instead focus on doing something completely else, and then return to that. So he would not burn out, let's say, by just writing a book or practicing a speech. He might do something else in between and then return to that.
Yeah, it's very important. The brain really likes variety
Mhm.
and it learns through variety. And so that's extremely important. And something in this sort of, Zoom world that kids are on, taking school right now on Zoom. And that's really, I think, challenging for a lot of them because they're just not getting that variety, right? They're not physically moving, they're not seeing anything different. And so it's a interesting problem. There are a lot of benefits to the Zoom. I mean, here we are, this is great,
Right.
but I think it's so important for parents to think about this, because we don't know what's gonna happen to this next generation and the development of their brains, because that deeper part of the brainstem does move slower, and it really needs to be nurtured in that way. So yeah, I mean, Feldenkrais wanted this to be taught in all schools, and that was before, any advent of even the home computer. So
Right.
it's
Is
interesting.
like I read somewhere that in Sweden, their national healthcare uses Feldenkrais a little bit.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah.
But it seems most countries that Feldenkrais is not really used much at all, and that's a darn shame because I think given my small experience with just one session, I saw the potential of it that it can help a lot of people.
Yeah, there are pockets, I think. Feldenkrais came to the US only twice and did two training programs, one in the Bay Area and one in Massachusetts. And so, there are really a lot of pockets of people that know about it, but I think there's more practitioners in all of Germany than in the US. So I think
Oh,
you people get hung up on the name a little bit also, but I think it's just also that it's not, I don't know, in America, we're very driven and we're very forward and we're very competitive. And this is kind of the opposite of that. And so it's hard for people to try something new when I can't guarantee what they're going to get out of it because I'm not, everybody is so different. I'll give one lesson to 200 people and they're going to feel 200 different things. It's
does
going to just a
do
need.
professional people ever, like basketball players or MMA fighters or golfers, or do they often do Feldenkrais?
Yeah, I think if people know about it, right, it's just about what they know about. But there's another practitioner here in town, one of my mentors who works a lot with golfers and a lot with more with sports. He's worked with the Olympic diving team. And so that there, again, there's pockets of people that know about it. And in terms of the medical side, there are, there are certain, like in California, Kaiser will actually send you to a Feldenkrais practitioner if you want first, to avoid certain surgeries. So there are like pockets where people know about it and well, they'll actually reimburse it. And then there are, places that it's just, what is that word? Feldenkrais, you know?
Right. I
So
think in today's age, I think these things should be, because it's the golden age of information. So I think these things ought to be known, because I think if things are, I'm more of a pragmatist on these things. If things are working and things are good, then they should be widely used. Why, because people often don't know, and then they go for the harder option.
yeah, and I don't know about where you are, but I know in America there tends to be like a quick fix, is very much a part of the society. I mean, it's not in our society to have self inquiry, right? And so the taking the pill, having the surgery is often people's first. They're just that's what's recommended by the doctor, so that's what they do. And I'm married to a doctor, so I'm not putting down doctors.
Right.
Like really when they learn that. But I think they what they do is look, if I have cancer, I'm not going to go to a Feldenkrais practitioner to diagnose that, right? So it's like just trying to get people educated about all the different options available to them. But also, for people who haven't had a life of self-inquiry, it's challenging. It can be really challenging to slow down as much as I'm asking people to. Um, but people who
Right.
are motivated to avoid surgery, they will do it. It just takes them longer.
Yeah, oftentimes it's like when people have pain, or there's something really not working, that they're starting to be, well, what have I got to lose? I will try anything if it helps.
Right.
And that's
Right.
probably a lot of people that you get. They're like, oh, I don't know what's wrong with me, but if anything will help, if you'll help, that's great.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I think like most people kind of wait a long time until something is really acute. And then, because sometimes people ask, well, how often should I come? And it really depends on the situation. I mean, if you have been walking, in a way that tears your knee up for the last 40 years, it's going to take more than one session to feel a really big change. But for some people like you had that one session and look how memorable it was. So kind of really depends on the nervous system and it depends on the person and their whole sort of world. And that's the other thing's a little challenging about it. We're not super prescriptive, because we consider it to be an education rather than a healing modality or something. Now you can make that argument that becoming more educated is healing.
Right.
Um, but we really put ourselves in the education category because it's just you can take it as far and as deep as you want and as you need at any point in your life. I mean, I have people come to me and then they leave and then they come back in years and they drop in on classes and then they come, and that's totally great and wonderful. That's just, I think, the natural flow of a person's relationship with themselves.
Yeah,
And
of
when,
course.
yeah.
Um, talk about exercise. Did he ever prescribe people to exercise and stuff like that? Because most people nowadays, they're like, oh yeah, I should exercise, or I should do at least this. Did because I'm not familiar with this at all, what he said about exercise. So just
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly either. The word exercise is interesting, because so one of the books that he wrote, Awareness for Movement, he wrote for the general public. So he goes through these movement lessons. And in there, he calls them exercises. Do this exercise, move your eyes left to right 10 to 15 times. And he uses the word exercise because that's what the public understands.
right.
He does not mean exercise in the sense of like do these repetitions so many times. Everything that he taught was prescribed or attached to a function. And so if somebody came to him, there's a great picture of him with this famous basketball player. I'll look it up and send it to you. To who he worked with, obviously, again, somebody very physically active. Um, I don't think he would have told somebody directly that you need to run 20 minutes a day in order, he wasn't a doctor, so he wasn't looking at like heart health or something,
Right.
but he what he was really interested in is creating the condition for that person's nervous system to do whatever it wants,
Hmm.
right? So for me, I wanted to learn how to be a more physically active person because I just didn't have any relationship with it. And I was just frankly lazy. I mean, I was a musician. I grew up sitting playing piano for hours. I just didn't care
Right.
until I wanted to, but then I didn't know what the heck to do. It was like every time I went running, I'd sprain my ankle or every time, right? And so it was like doing these awareness of movement lessons helped me feel myself in space in a way that allowed me to go exercise, that
Hmm.
allowed me to learn how to swim, that allowed me to learn how to, do yoga or ride a bike better. So I would imagine that he would never be prescriptive, like
Right.
that he should do 20 minutes of this a day. That would be like kind of anti-Feldenkrais because it's not organic to the person's desire and it really inner world and tuning into that and what would make that person feel the best.
So it seems like because I've heard of stories from people that some people are just they get injured frequently and all that. But what I'm hearing from you is that perhaps they were just using their body in the quote unquote wrong way, and that's the and in doing that, then the chance of injury obviously is a lot higher, right?
Right, right, exactly. So, I mean, I think there is this sort of, especially with exercise, it's like drive to push yourself
Hmm.
for a lot of people. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing unless that person doesn't have um, the opposite of that, the ability to slow down and recover and really feel yourself before you engage in physical activity and engage in the quality. So something we talk a lot about in this work is the quality of movement. So is your movement harsh, bumpy, rigid, or is there a sort of subtle, adaptability to it? So we were really interested in whatever somebody wants to be able to do. Can you adapt and can you change and can you make it more fluid and more satisfying? I mean, wouldn't it be great if that were the aim in physical education classes to get kids to move in a satisfying way? Because then movement is life. You're moving throughout your whole life. So that would be such a more satisfying life if everyone had the tools to know what was satisfying to them.
Is there part of meditation as part of this? Because it seems to me that some of the stuff that people are holding in their bodies are emotional in origin. So it seems like as you are doing the one-on-one or group sessions, that there's unlocking of things. So does sometimes emotional stuff come up when people do this?
Absolutely. So Feldenkrais always said that coordinated action is a harmonious relationship between thinking, sensing, moving, and feeling. So feeling being the emotional states, really. And on my blog, I wrote an article recently about, or sometime since the pandemic, uh, everything feels recent,
Right.
but I call it the coordinated action pie. So that if you influence one piece of the pie, right? So maybe you're just like a huge thinker and you don't feel much, you don't want to feel your emotions, right? We all know people like that,
Yeah.
super, super not emotional. You can see it in the way they, you know, live their lives. Well, if they start to influence maybe like how they start to sense themselves in the world, that influences that part of that pie, and it might grow the emotional part for a while. And we all know people who are super emotional. They just cannot see anything logically, right? It's just very, very emotional. And it's the same kind of thing if you start to influence. Well, what happens if instead of getting, when you start to feel that emotion rise up, what if you start working on your movement more? I usually feel way better after I, move in order to like move my emotional state out.
Right.
There are several practitioners who are also Zen meditators. My trainer was a Zen person.
Nice.
Linda Delman and Dennis Leary, who's no longer with us, was also a longtime Zen meditator. And I've had to practice meditating throughout my experience, on and off. And so there is an element of that, I think, but Feldenkrais himself, I think, really, I think it was all one to him. I don't know that he had a meditation practice per se, but I think that these awareness and movement lessons are almost meditative in their nature and in their inquiry. It's almost like a moving meditation. Some people think it's almost like Tai Chi. It is, but then it's also gives you a lot of information about how things are related and how your skeleton can work. So it's quite dynamic, I think. But
There's sometimes people come from Tai Chi to Feldenkrais and they're like, oh, it improved my Tai Chi.
right, and that's the thing where everybody has their orientation, right? So I think it was Dennis Leary actually who did a set of workshops that was like Feldenkrais as a movement practice, Feldenkrais as an emotional practice, Feldenkrais as a spiritual practice, Feldenkrais as a scientific practice. And so he went through and picked, these workshops and lessons surrounding all these different topics. And again, for some people, that's really uncomfortable. They want something that's right in their lane that they understand. Oh, this is going to help me with my Tai Chi. Because any will for a
Right.
little while, and that's great. And then other people find, wow, this is really a new way to live. I'm going to go do a training program.
Do you think it might help with Tai Chi? Because Tai Chi is very, well, it's not walking, but it's still a sort of movement. So,
Oh, yeah, I think Tai Chi is kind of accessing that same part of the brainstem. That's a very slow movement and slow sort of inquiry. In awareness and movement lessons, though, we ask a lot more questions, very for you to answer within yourselves, to see, well, gosh, I don't know if I feel that, so you start to sense where your blind spots are. I'm actually doing a series of lessons in November on the self-image, because that's something that he talked a lot about, that the self-image is really the brain's picture that it makes of the self, right? So it's not so much like self-esteem, it's a little more dynamic than that. It's about really how does your system work in space. And so we're going to start to inquire about, blind spots. So things that we can't sense or we can't feel, we can't use. So these lessons kind of give you a lot of information for uncovering where is that part of my spine? How do I use it? And then that clarifies the self-image that you can then use in the world. So we're all about getting out into the world with this stuff.
okay, I want to get some more benefits. So, because in the early days when I researched this, it was people said it helped them run. So I'm thinking if that's true, then why isn't this like widely used among athletes? Do they just not know, or they're already like physically very uh, mobile, and obviously they like to run, so their bodies are pretty much operating almost at full capacity, so they're probably like n- would
Well,
need it in a way. I don't know.
I think that your earlier comment about, I think that people don't know what they don't know, and they don't care, and while everything's working. If everything's working fine, then why would you inquire?
Right. Why mess with something that works, right?
Right, exactly. And there's some honest truth to that. Um, I don't know that I would want everyone coming to me, just to come to me. But there is, I think, also a challenge for people who are very physically active to slow down as much as we want them to. And so it can be immensely helpful. And there are a lot of athletes that use it, but I think there are also just a lot of other things on the market these days too. You know, Feldenkrais was maybe one of the earliest somatic people, and there are a lot of other methods that sort of have mimicked, and probably just get at what people are looking for, maybe in a different way or maybe similarly.
Are you
Um,
talking about the Alexander technique? Is that one?
Not necessarily. Alexander was actually before Feldenkrais. He was a little
Okay.
old. Yeah. And so Alexander and Feldenkrais are just a little bit apples and oranges. They're both fruit. They're both wonderful. Um, but there are other modalities, kinesiology or whatnot, that I think, because of their popularity, just through their name or whatever, it's just people know about it. So, but
Right.
we're starting to do a little bit better job as a community getting out there. I mean, there was a New York Times article and a Wall Street Journal article in the last couple of years, on the method. But what's hard about it, I think, is that it just encompasses so much internal work that it's hard to quantify it and study it in a way that then markets it as, this cure all or something, because it's not what it's about. It's really about education. And so people sometimes just, they don't want to be educated necessarily. They want to be fixed. And I think there's something in the nature of this inquiry that can be challenging for people to slow down enough. Um, but they do. I mean, if they're in enough pain, they will.
And also, I think in my experience of watching sports, if what happens if let's say if there was a hypothetically, if there was a successful team that started to be really good, and one of the things they were using was Feldenkrais, the other teams will start to copy it to see, just to get a, because they don't want to lose the edge. So that's what happens in sports, and it has good and bad points, but that's definitely one of the good points is that because they because sports is one of those things you have to be physically very well prepared, but there's a lot of other elements and there's a lot of other factors, and it seems to me that Feldenkrais could be another factor, and could be recovery and all that is other factors as well, and the mental. And another thing you mentioned before is relaxation, because in my dabbling with a little bit with acting years ago, it was I noticed that especially if you film something, or if you do let's say do theater, that people get nervous, and when you get nervous the performance isn't good, and that's the same with usually in sports. If you're too nervous, you're gonna mess up, you're not gonna hit the shot. So to get relaxed, and is that something that Feldenkrais can get more people to relax as well?
But I would change the word a little bit, I think, because whether it's sports or music or theater, anything that's performance oriented has this has this element of performance anxiety and then what to do about it and how to work with it. So one thing that we talk about is the nervous system and the where you are in it. Are you in the fight or flight? Are you in the relaxed, and thinking of it as a spectrum. So whether you're on the parasympathetic side or the sympathetic side, that how do you notice the signs before your nervous system thinks a bear's coming, right? And you need to run.
Right.
That's nervousness essentially, right? And that's just some old habit in our system, really, for survival. Um, and so when you start to think of it in those terms, you can start to think, oh, okay, well, what are the signs that I'm heading in that direction to flee the bear? How does that, how does that represent in my skill set? What starts to happen? And then how do you start to interrupt that habit? Right? So that when you start to get nervous, you use, certain techniques and skills to steer yourself in the other direction, which also you don't want to go too far relaxed,
Yeah.
because you don't have enough anxiety to do the task. So starting to teach people that there's this sort of linear, you know, kind of like a scale, that you're somewhere always in between, including when you're learning. So people who learn under a lot of anxiety or have had anxiety around learning, they struggle too, because their nervous system's always a little bit on edge, right? So how do we start to incorporate observing people and helping them get to a calmer place in their nervous system before they try to take information in about how to change that basketball, or how to get better at math, whatever the thing is. So it's a lot of observation, and it's a lot of really deep breath work also, um, and starting to really use the breath on that spectrum to get yourself where you want to go.
You said math, so people can improve math. Because one of the questions that I wanted to ask you is that chess, because it doesn't seem related, but I think it is. Do you think, and I think it would be fantastic if somebody did a study of this. Does Feldenkrais help you improve your chess score? Because this is something you can measure right away.
Yeah, right. I mean, yeah, because chess is such a internal, yeah, it's such an internal process.
Yeah.
Um, and focus and making decisions and choices, and what happens when you start to panic. Um, yeah, I think that'd be a great study. Let's write a grant.
Yeah, somebody that has money, or let's go GoFundMe.com and do it. Let's do it. Let's study. Talking about studies. Are there any studies recent? Because like a lot of people in the Western world, they're like big believers in double blind studies and whatnot. So for those kind of people, are they kind of any studies that have been done in the past 20 years that prove some of the things that it helps you run faster or anything like that?
Yeah, there's a Feldenkrais, trying to think. So there's an International Feldenkrais Federation, and within that organization, I believe there's a group of individuals. I'm trying to remember the name of it. Um, I'll look it up for you and send it to you so you can share it with your listeners. But they actually are responsible for doing some more scientific studies around the method. And the one that I think of is a study on hamstring length, and showing that doing awareness through movement lessons around, a lot of people, athletes, right? I have tight hamstrings and you can't really stretch them. But this idea that by slowing down the movement such that you can soften the tissues so that they can lengthen. Uh,
Wow.
there has been a study done about that, and I know that one because I've shared that with friends before who have given me that line. I have really tight hamstrings.
But that goes to into as well injury prevention, because to think of one of my favorite players, Kobe Bryant, he had the injury in 2013 where he tore his Achilles.
Mhm.
And hypothetically, do you think if he was doing Feldenkrais, there'd be less of a chance of that happening?
Yes. Yeah,
That's
I
interesting.
know. Because look, it's what you're doing in a Feldenkrais lesson is you're learning how to listen to yourself before you go do big fast activities or any activities. And the ability to cultivate ease in your movements that's what it is. That's what we're looking at. So, you know, how do you start to sense that you're overusing yourself before you injure yourself? What is that like at any stage, whether you're high level basketball, whether you're Kobe Bryant or you're 60 years old and have been very active, but all of a sudden, you're scared to, go on a hike. How do you access that ability to listen to yourself and make choices based upon where your nervous system is in each moment? And I think it would be fantastic. And there are a lot of athletes who have used, I just don't have a list for you, but
Right.
it's not, it's not super like widely known, which I think, hopefully we're working on that.
Yeah, like one of the most famous athletes, LeBron James, reportedly spends $1 million a year for just maintaining his body at a top shape. But I'm not sure if Feldenkrais is one of those things that he uses, because he uses a lot of different coaches and stuff.
Yeah, I have no idea, but you can give them my number.
I, I don't have any context, but yeah, that would be awesome if. But this is what happens. Somebody starts it, and it takes one team or one player mentioning it in some way, and because like years ago, it was a simple thing. It was one player went vegan and he lost weight, and then other players started doing the same because they wanted to be faster and also retain the muscle or whatever, so they also went vegan. So that's something some players do now.
Mm,
So but I
yeah,
think the same could happen with this method.
absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's just, again, it's like the pockets that know about it.
Yeah.
And it is a little bit elusive, when you're in the middle of it, it's wow, this is novel. And then you learn what you need to learn and you don't think about it because you know it, right? So
Right.
where that kind of coming back to it and revisiting it can be helpful for a lot of people.
Yeah, because funny enough, I never consciously think of like walking, but sometimes I'd be like, um I know it occurred to me that I was walking maybe more stressed or a certain way, but maybe it's from maybe it was from Feldenkrais. I'm not sure, but it was if I was walking in a different way, I'd always be like, there's something off.
Yeah, well, again, it's that ability to just listen to yourself and inquiry. I mean, you don't want to do that every second of your life because you need
Right.
some habits, right, to function. Um, and that's why we spread these training programs out over, 4 years, because if you did it all in 1 year, I don't think it would work. You'd have to just quit your life or something for a year. Um, but yeah, I think there's definitely something to just that inquiry, whether then, I mean, the other thing is that this is a beautiful method and a wonderful package, but Feldenkrais said himself, what is the method? A method that somebody comes up with is destroyed in 2 to 3 generations, because that's just the nature of, people taking the work and changing it and making it their own, essentially. So he said, I don't even really call this a method. But of course, he left us an amazing body of work to reference and use. So it is a method. But philosophically speaking, what is it? It's this ability to listen, it's ability to make choices, it's the ability to
Right.
do things differently.
The,
Should
the-
you want?
this reminds me of Bruce Lee, where he took something from every system of martial arts, but he was like did develop Jeet Kune Do, I think it was, but it was using no method as the method. Like that was his thing, because everything um, if you want to be the best, you want to use what works and discard the rest, kind of. And he's famous, be like water and all that. That seems to
That's
be something that Feldenkrais embraces, the method to kind of like. Yeah, I'm really thinking this could really help martial artists like MMA fighters.
it. Yeah, and the ones that know about it know about it. And we have lots of practitioners who are also martial artists, and I have worked with some martial artists who, after they have a session or two, they just can't believe how much clearer, because especially this method, because he was a martial artist. So a lot of these lessons are breakdowns of martial art movements, but in such a way that you actually learn it, right? Instead of it's like, oh, just keep practicing for 100 years and you'll be able to do that judo roll. I remember doing judo rolls in our training program, and I just couldn't believe that I was doing. I was like, I just did that, and I'm going to do it again. And I don't know anything about mixed martial arts at all, but here I am doing a judo roll, and it was like, I remember being at a party, and it was like a party trick. Like, look what Erin can do. And it's like, and somebody was like, how did you do that? Like, then they get interested, right? It's like, well, I took 2 hours and learned, but it's because I learned how to learn. That's the big key, is how to break things down and really enter the nervous system in a somatic way, in a body-based way.
That's
So
amazing. I think, yeah, this is an amazing method for pain relief, for musicians, for pretty much everybody.
pretty much everybody. Yeah.
Yeah. So where can people find you? If our listeners or watchers
Yeah.
wanna,
Well, I have a website, erinfinkelstein.com, and that's Finkelstein. I have a info at erinfinkelstein.com is my email address. On Facebook, I have a Feldenkrais for musicians and the general public page that I'm trying to keep up on that. I have a class on Thursday mornings that anyone can attend. And if your listeners email me and drop me a line and mention your podcast, you can come to the first one for free. And
mention all that jazz.
that's right, all that jazz. And those are 9:30 in the morning, Mountain Time. And then within that, I have a monthly subscription for $40, where you can have access to my entire library of awareness through movement lessons. There are about 55 of them since the pandemic started. So, and then I work with people one-on-one all over Zoom right now, because we
Yeah.
can't do functional integration right now. It's too intimate. But hopefully soon. But what's great is I've been able to work with people who have movement issues over Zoom anywhere in the world. So a silver lining I never perceived would happen.
That's amazing. I think that they are positive to technology, obviously, but hopefully, I can't imagine like 10 years of this. So, man, no, nah, that's just, it'll go back to normal.
No, yeah, I think we'll go back to some kind of society where we can function and see people and still take care of, our elderly and people who are vulnerable. So I think we will strike that balance in the next few years, hopefully.
Lastly, I'm kind of mind blown that Feldenkrais could help you with chess. I never thought I would.
So, I mean, I don't see why it couldn't. I think you just have to have the right practitioner to help you navigate what's going on.
Do you think it's if you do one-on-one session versus group, do you think there's a big difference? Obviously, because one-on-one is hands-on and
It
is able to see if you're moving a certain way that's very rigid.
Yeah, I think it depends on the person and how they learn. So some people learn better verbally, right? Some people I give a whole lesson and I don't say anything, and it's all touch based. And they can't perceive that they feel anything different because they didn't hear it through their ears.
Right.
But if I say, Can you feel how this movement is connected, of your leg is connected to your pelvis? Can you feel that? Where else can you feel it? Then they go, oh, hmm, oh, interesting. I never knew that. Other people in an awareness through movement class, they would prefer to have it translated into touch. They feel it better, or they understand it better with me moving their shoulder up, and 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 they will just feel where it goes. Whereas if they try to do it, maybe they just can't find that smoothness
Hmm.
when they're hearing it. So it's a little bit, they work well together, but it's a little bit dependent on the person and just how they learn. So the one-on-ones over Zoom have been a little of both. It's a little of me watching somebody move and then directing their attention somewhere, and then maybe even taking their own hand to feel what is the shape of your collarbone. Did you know it connects here, and that's how your arm, that's where your arm comes from.
Hmm.
That's where it hangs off your skeleton. So it's a lot of observation and noticing where the blind spots are for people, and sort of finding the way to introduce them to that part of themselves.
Good. So it's a positive thing that you can still mostly work through Zoom. So it's
Yeah, it's been great. Yeah.
okay, and it's also been great having you on the podcast. I really
You.
appreciate you. I think we've all learned a lot, and thank you for the skeleton also to be on the podcast the first time.
Very
Very
good.
observant, attentive.
He does a good job.
Great stand-in.
Yes. Thank you so much for having me. I'm glad you found me all the way here in Phoenix, Arizona. It was really a pleasure talking to you.
Pleasure is all mine, and I thank you, the guests, for listening or watching. Thank you.
Thank you.